Good evening. It's good to see you, and it's good to be with you this Wednesday evening. We're going to continue our discussion about Bible translations, and tonight we're going to look at some of what's called variances, or some of the differences, and in particular, we're going to look at some of the verses, particular verses, in certain translations that are less than ideal. We'll say it like that, and then I'll let you judge beyond that. We'll look at some of the problem passages in a few of the different versions. We're not going to look at all of them. There are a lot that in different versions that are less than ideal. We're just going to pick some out and take a look. In beginning, though, I want to say this. If you're using a version that we put up on the screen tonight and that we say things about, I don't want you to get your feelings hurt about that. If you're using a Bible version that you know and that you understand and that you're comfortable with, good for you, and keep using it. If you see something you have questions about, let's talk about it. I am not a Bible translation expert at all, not even close, but we can talk about what God's Word says. We can work through it. So if you have any questions or concerns, we'll be glad to talk about it. Before we begin, though, Floyd, would you lead us in prayer, please?
Our Heavenly Father, we humbly bow in prayer at this time to thank you for another opportunity for us to come to assemble at this time during this midweek, spend time with our brothers and sisters in Christ, learn more about the Word, apply it to our lives, continue to ask prayers for those that are afflicted, these cold, bitter times. During this pandemic, we ask you to watch over all of those and keep us all safe. Let's make good decisions that affect those around us. Be with us, guide, Lord, direct us, and produce all of these things.
Amen. Now we'll get right into it, but first I want to remind you about the various translations that we talked about last week. I know some of that is kind of small, but maybe you can see it. The top 10 now have changed over the past few years, but this is the list from pretty recent. And so what we're going to do is just talk about some variances. Before we do that, I want to give you some background on the different manuscripts. They're classified two different ways. So 80% about of existing manuscripts are referred to as Byzantine. Those are the ones from which the King James Version and the New King James Version are translated. They are the ones that have been around a long time. And back in, when was the King James translated? 1611 to 08 to 11, yeah. Back then, the Byzantine manuscripts were the ones that were used, and there's a bunch of them. There's thousands of manuscript fragments and pieces. However, most of the modern translations, the ASV, the New American Standard, ESV, Christian Standard, and so on, use primarily, not exclusively, but primarily the Alexandrian manuscripts. They're dated much earlier. They go back to about the 400s. Now, the way you can kind of remember that, if your mind works like my mind does, is the ones that were discovered later are earlier. That's kind of how I remember that. The later discoveries contain the earlier manuscripts, the manuscripts closer to the time the originals were written. Many of the Alexandrian manuscripts were not discovered until after the King James had been translated. Think Dead Sea Scrolls. It kind of helps you think about what we're talking about. Some major discoveries that have a lot of manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts that can be used and compared with all the others that we already have. And so these thousands of manuscripts and fragments are being compared, and from those then we end up with these newer translations. The older ones are thought to be of more value simply because they are closer to the time frame of the original writings. We won't go into what we talked about last week about the reasons why we have so much confidence in these and all that, but that's kind of a general look at the different translations and why there are going to be variances, because we're talking about different manuscripts from different time frames. Now, these 3 points you can get really quickly. Most variances in Hebrew and Greek manuscripts are spelling differences, things related to copying by hand over the years. You can imagine that with less than ideal situations, circumstances, inks, pens, papers, and so on, that you're going to have some discrepancies and so on. They have no bearing on the text. In fact, what they really do, when you see a misspelling or something like that in those manuscripts, and you're comparing hundreds and thousands of them, when you see all of that, And so much of the information is exactly the same. Those spelling errors pop out as the problem. There aren't textual problems. There are copying by hand problems, generally speaking. And then there are, and we'll get to it a little bit later tonight, there are times where there is a section not present in one manuscript that is in another manuscript and so on. But when you put it all together, it increases your faith in it all because there's so much of it. It's not like, we talked about last week, it's not like the Apostle Paul wrote one letter and we think we have that letter. We're not sure if it's the original letter, but we're told it's the original letter, but we don't know for sure. There's so many of these that we can be confident that what we have is verbal inspiration. Our confidence level goes up because we have so much information. Okay, another real quick look at a translation continuum. I know it's hard to see if you're in the back, but the whole idea of word for word versus thought for thought is not simply saying we took this word and put the English equivalent to it, and so we match words. That's not the idea. The idea is we're structuring the sentence more like the Greek structure, or we're structuring the sentence more like English. That's kind of the continuum. And so we want a good mix of that, and we typically tend to lean toward the word for word because we want it as close as we can get it, as the structure would allow for us to read it in English. Okay, we're going to look at some areas of concern for the King James Version. The reason we're going to do that is because it's very, very popular. And so we want to look at some of the areas of concern that we see in the King James Version, some things that most of them are not a big deal, but the biggest thing that we see, obviously, is that the Old English is sometimes difficult for people to understand. It's sometimes difficult for young people and for visitors to understand. Now, I've given you three little examples there. The way show is printed in the King James Version. The word peradventure that you see in Romans chapter 5, you know what peradventure means? And the word to wit, the words to wit, you see those in the King James. Those can be looked up and dealt with. It's not anything that you can't overcome. But young people tend to not understand when they hear that. So that's just one of the issues that we have to deal with. Then you have in these two passages, 1 Samuel 25 and 1 Kings 14, you have simply bad translation decisions. I'm not going to read it to you tonight out of the King James Version. You can do that for yourself. It's a bad translation decision. The point is made. It's just not a good choice of words. So let's look at this. There's several passages we'll look at with the King James Version. And we'll do this with another version, and we'll just kind of get in our minds how we look at these different Bible passages, how we look at these different translations. And if you have a question, go ahead and grab my attention. If you need to raise your hand to keep from falling asleep, that's okay too. We'll kind of go through this as quickly as we can. Matthew chapter 4 and verse 2, we're talking about Jesus at what point? What's Matthew chapter 4 beginning going to talk about? Anybody remember? The temptation of Jesus, right? It reads like this in the King James. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward an hungered. Now, that's not a big deal, is it? We understand what it means, but that's what the King James Version says. That's how it reads. And it's translated that way because that's what the manuscripts that were used said. We understand the point. We understand what the writer, Matthew, is getting at. And we understand where inspiration led him. But the translators aren't inspired. Matthew was. Translators not. And so we have to be able to deal with that. And you'll see things like that from time to time. Hebrews 4 and verse 8. In the King James Version, it says, "For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward spoken of another day." Who is the Hebrew writer talking about when he says, if so-and-so had given them rest? Who's he talking about? Do you remember? And I know I'm catching you off guard on these passages. You know what he's talking about? In the context, he's talking about Joshua. If Joshua had given them rest, then there would not be references to the rest of the Lord, the rest of God to come. Hebrews 3 and 4 is many times in there references the rest that God will bring to his people. And so his point is, if Joshua, when he brought them into the promised land, had provided for them rest indefinitely, then we wouldn't be waiting on a bigger, greater rest of God. But the King James uses the word Jesus there instead of the word Joshua. Now, in old Hebrew times, those words may have been interchangeable. It may have been like Bob and Robert. I don't know. That's what I am told, so good. But that's a difficult thing for some to manage if they don't know that and if they're just studying through the text and come upon Hebrews chapter 4. The context makes it difficult with the term Jesus there. Matthew 23:24 is an easy one for us to understand. It is one word that is not translated well. Ye blind guides which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Are we straining at a gnat? Is that what we're doing? All the other versions would render it, we're straining out a gnat. We're catching the gnat, getting rid of the gnat. We're not straining toward the gnat. It's no big deal, but it is one of those issues. Matthew 27:44, I've never understood this one. The Lord is on the cross. Matthew 27:44, the King James says, the thieves also which were crucified with him cast the same in his teeth. What does that mean? No. Other versions, I'm not sure. Yeah. Other versions would say something like they were casting the same insults at him. They were saying the same things at him. The thief on the cross was treating Jesus like everybody else was treated. They were ridiculing him. But the phrase is, they cast the same in his teeth. We have to look that up, and we can understand it, but it doesn't fit. It doesn't flow with us as we would normally read it. Then Acts 12 and verse 4 mentions Easter. The Greek word there is P-A-S-C-H-A. It's 29 times rendered something other than Easter. It's only rendered Easter here. It's usually rendered Passover or meal of the Passover or lamb of the Passover. It has to do with the Passover. But here it's Easter. Again, not a big deal, but one of those things that kind of makes you wonder. The one that is a big deal, really the only issue, if you will, that I would have with the King James Version is Matthew chapter 16, verse 19. It's just not as well done as some of the other versions. It says, and whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. How do other versions read? Anybody have that? Matthew 16, 19. Okay. Shall have been bound and shall have been loosed indicates who is doing the binding and loosing. God. And you know that. You've studied the passage. You've heard discussions about that. You know that. And so when you read that in the King James Version, you understand what it means. When someone who doesn't know all of that reads it, it could lead you to maybe a difficult conclusion. However, I have maintained all along that these are manageable things. We can manage this. We can work through this, and we can deal with this. If you're using the King James Version, keep using it, and keep enjoying it, and keep studying God's Word. It, like the other versions, has some difficulties, but it's a good translation. It's a good translation. Just keep in mind the 1 Corinthians 14 rule about edification and intelligibility. The rule that comes out of 1 Corinthians 14 is, if you can't understand it, it can't edify you. If you can't read it, grasp it, and deal with it, it can't help you. Let me say it another way. If somebody's sitting in here, if Glenn O tonight had with him a Greek Bible, a Bible written in Greek, knowing that Glenn doesn't speak Greek, doesn't read Greek, I would suggest he find another version. That one's not going to help you. It won't edify you. It won't encourage you. And so the idea is, if you have a version that you're comfortable with and that works for you, and you understand God's truth through it, that's fine. That's great. Keep going. If you have a version that you're not getting, that you're struggling with, it's going to be hard for it to do its job for you. Got to be able to read it for it to help. One other thing about the King James Version, and really all of them, and that is Don't look at the King James as the standard by which all other translations should be judged. No English version of the text is the standard by which other versions must be judged. Now, I know we compare them, that's fine, but don't exclude translations because they don't measure up to another translation. It's not the English translations that are the standard, it's the manuscripts that are the standard. That's what matters. And so we compare things ultimately back to those manuscripts. Any questions about the King James? Anything you want to say about that? Yes, sir.
Is there a difference between version and translation?
The way I'm using it tonight, no, sir. No, sir. There may be technically or academically, but the way I'm using it tonight, no, sir. No, sir. Versions and translations, the way I'm using it, would all be the same thing. Anything about it? Do you kind of understand where we are with the King James? It works for some folks. It's solid for some folks. They're good at dealing with it and working on it. And that's fine. But it is not perfect, nor is any other translation. Good enough? All right, let's move on then. We'll talk a little bit about, I guess I wanted to emphasize that. We'll talk a little bit about the NIV. NIV's been around a while. The 1984 revision of the NIV caused some difficulties with Romans chapters 7 and 8 and some other passages in Galatians and so on. It caused some issues because it had a decidedly Calvinistic slant, or the idea of original sin. The fact, the belief that Adam's sin is inherited by everybody else. The NIV led us to believe that. And in their 2011 update, the NIV 11, they fixed that. To me, that's one of the most remarkable things. That the translation team looked at that in Romans 7 and 8 and said, that's probably not the best way to do that based on the manuscript evidence. So we need to make a change. And so they did make a change. And I think that is a wonderful and remarkable thing. This is the way the King James, New King James, New American Standard, ESV, and Christian Standard render Romans 8:5. You can read that hopefully on the screen. The phrase that we're after is according to the flesh. Those who are according to their flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. And that's kind of the way all of those translations render it. King James is a little bit different, but that's the idea. Those of us, we know this to be true, those of us who live according to the flesh have our minds set on the things of the flesh as opposed to spiritual things. This is the way the NIV 84 translated that. Those who live according to the sinful nature have their minds set on what the nature desires. And again, that kind of got back to this business of the Calvinistic view of us inheriting Adam's sin. The nature with which we're born then would be a sinful nature, and that's the problem. That's the thing we blame it on. The Bible doesn't teach the doctrine of original sin or of the Adamic sin or inherited sin at all, but the Calvinistic view of things does. And so the NIV 84 said that. That was a problem. It's something you had to really work around if you used that version. You had to understand that and deal with that. But again, they fixed it in the 11 revision. And so now it says basically what all the other versions say, which I think is a good thing. For them to have the ability to look at the body of work and say, we need to make some changes. That's a good thing. So I like the NIV 11, except for they fixed this problem, and that's commendable, but in so doing, they created a whole nother issue. And it's a whole other issue that I want us to talk about and study because it will show us how we have to be really careful with Bible translations and with what the text is trying to tell us as we put it into English. So in their effort to update in the 2011 version, they wanted to update to gender-neutral pronouns and plural pronouns. They wanted to update that. Now, does anybody know what that means? Anybody want to explain gender-neutral pronouns?
Not he or she, it's they.
They or them, right. Not he or she, but they or them. I have two different kind of lines of thought on this. I have no problem updating pronouns if our goal is to better clarify in English what the original was saying. For example, some of the newer versions, instead of saying brethren, will say brothers and sisters. That doesn't bother me one bit. I have no issue with that, because that is a further clarification, or maybe just a better use of today's English. We don't say brethren a lot, but we're very familiar with brothers and sisters. Maybe we say brethren a lot, maybe other folks don't. I have no issue with that. The whole idea of mankind for the word man, if the context bears that out, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what's called translating into English. We don't have a problem with that. But that's not what the translation team for the NIV 2011 did. Let me show you on the screen Hebrews 2:8. And it may be hard for you to read, and you might want to open your own Bible to Hebrews 2:8. It might be helpful for you to do that. I'm going to open mine to Hebrews 2:8 so I can see it. You might want to do that. Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 8. Now you're butting right in the middle of an Old Testament quotation. We're dealing with Hebrews 2:8, which has a quotation from Psalm 8 in it. So the Hebrew writer is making, let me tell you what he's doing first of all. He's making the point that Jesus has done his work and Jesus now rules. But he puts a little caveat there. He says, but he doesn't rule completely yet because the end of time hasn't come. His total work isn't yet finished. It's like what the Apostle Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when he said that when the last enemy is defeated, which is death, when the last enemy is defeated, then Jesus will turn over or hand the kingdom back to the Father. You remember that? So we're at a point where Jesus has already defeated death, but he hasn't defeated death completely, in that you and I have not yet been resurrected. He's defeated it for us, but until we're resurrected, we don't see the culmination of that completion. That's what the Hebrew writer's talking about. So the quotation, I'll read this one because the New American Standard puts Old Testament quotations in all caps. I've always liked that. Other versions do it differently. It's italicized in the New King James. It's in quotation marks in the ESV. It's bolded in the CSV, but I like the all caps. It jumps out at me so I can see it. The quotation is, "You have put all things in subjection under his feet. For in subjecting all things to him, he left nothing that is not subject to him, but now we do not yet see all things subjected to him." Okay. You know how to read these pronouns. Up here at the top, you is the Father, his is the Son. For in subjecting all things to Jesus, the Father left nothing that is not subject to him. But now we do not yet see all things subjected to Jesus. So that's the idea. That's the way it reads. And all of the versions read very, very closely to that. The NIV 2011, though, got themselves into a mess with this plural, gender-neutral pronoun business. And so theirs reads like this: "And put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them, yet at present we do not see everything subject to them." It's really hard to get Jesus out of them. It's really hard to understand that the Father placed everything under the authority of Jesus, which is the point, out of those pronouns. And so if you're reading through that, the question is, who's the what? Who's the them? Who did God subject everything to? It reads as if it's not a person, it is a group of people. Now, why in the world would they do that? Well, the reason they did that is because they mishandled the original that this passage is dealing with, Psalm 8. So here's Psalm 8. You can see Psalm 8, verses 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the screen. Psalm 8. You remember Psalm 8? "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon, the stars, which you have set in place." Remember that? The NIV 2011 says, "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them?" Somebody want to turn over to Psalm 8 and verse 4? Doesn't matter to me what version you have. Psalm 8 and verse 4. Somebody turn over there and read just verse 4 for us out of your Bible. Whatever version you have. Psalm 8, verse 4. Somebody read that for me, please.
What is man that you are mindful of, the Son of Man
the Son of Man, that you care for him. Okay. The word human beings there on your screen that's underlined, you see that? That the NIV 2011 put in there? The Hebrew words for human being there are Ben Adam. What does Ben Adam mean, you figure? Son of Adam, son of man. It is a small a. It is not referencing really the person Adam as much as it is referencing man, but it is the Son of Man. Every other version says Son of Man. So, what happened, it seems, is they dealt with Psalm 8 from the standpoint of plural pronouns and gender-neutral pronouns. And then when we get over to Hebrews chapter 2, we pull in Psalm 8 and we're dealing with those pronouns. And so the quotation that you can see over here still, the quotation has their feet in it. The quotation ends, and so the Hebrew writer continues, and they continue with that plural gender-neutral pronoun. And it really messes up Hebrews chapter 2. So, with all of that, I want you to think about how the words really matter and the choices really matter. And to clarify by using brothers and sisters or mankind, that's great. But you can go too far with that and create some issues with it. You have any questions or comments about that? One other passage that the NIV has kind of had a bad rap on for a long time is its treatment of Psalm 51. Psalm 51, of course, is the Psalm of David where he confesses his sin. He begins in verse 1 by saying, "Be gracious to me, O God, according to your loving kindness. Wash me thoroughly." Verse 2, "Against you and against you only have I sinned." In verse 3 and 4, that's the psalm, and that's what he's expressing. In Psalm 51 and verse 5, here's how the King James, the New King James, the New American Standard, and the ESV render it. "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." That's the King James Version. The others indicate that David is saying, "I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me." These passages sometimes give folks a really difficult time. And sometimes folks just aren't sure how to deal with what David is saying here. If you factor in what the Christian Standard Version says, which I really don't prefer, it says, "Indeed, I was guilty when I was born. I was sinful when my mother conceived me." And then the NIV, which says, "Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me." You find yourself thinking in terms of original sin again, born sinful. And for a long time, folks have said, well, the NIV says you were born sinful in Psalm 51:5. And now the Christian Standard Bible says you're born sinful. I was guilty when I was born, and that's not true. And so those versions have to go because that's not true. I don't like those renderings in red, but they're not much different from the other four that are up there. And so what is it that explains for us what David is talking about in Psalm 51:5? How do you reconcile what David says with the fact that we're not born sinful? Was David wrong? Was David stating a biblical truth when he said what he said? We talked about this a few months ago. It is a statement of hyperbole. It is a statement of over-exaggeration. Look at it like this. It is the statement of a man who is guilty of sin and knows it and is admitting it. And his position in that moment, that very emotional moment, his position is, ever since I was born, I've been sinful. It's as if you and I would say, seems like every day of my life, I have committed sin against God. It's as if I haven't had one day where I wasn't sinful in God's eyes. From the time I was born, I've had the sin problem. It is a statement of hyperbole. It is an over-exaggeration of his circumstance. Now, it's easy to say that, but how might we know that? Well, look back at the text there. He says in, let's see here, in verse 7, "Purify me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me and I shall be whiter than snow. Do you think he literally is going to become whiter than snow if the Lord washes him? Is that literally what he's expecting to happen? It's not a literal statement. It's a figurative statement. It's designed to depict what he's after. Anybody know what hyssop is? Yeah, know a good way to describe what that is? It's kind of from the mint family. Crush up the leaves, medicinal kind of thing. So wash me with that. It's kind of like a medicinal washing. We're really going to get it clean here. And that's what he's after. He says in verse 8, make me to hear joy and gladness. Let the bones which you have broken rejoice. Now, do you think the Lord broke some of David's bones? What do you think? Somebody's going to have to answer. Most likely not. Most likely not. So what does that mean? It's kind of like what he said in Psalm 32. He is crushed by the weight of his sin. The Lord didn't do that to him. But the way he describes it is the righteousness of God compared to the sinfulness of me is crushing. It's breaking me into pieces. That's what David is expressing. And so his statement in that context is a statement with which most of us can relate if we're honest with ourselves. There are times when it seems like I was brought forth in iniquity. Times when it seems like from the very beginning I've had the sin problem. David is not saying anything about original sin or the Adamic sin. He knew nothing of Calvinism. He's just saying how it feels when you've really messed up and when you see a pattern of having really messed up. And to make that right sometimes causes us to see things in extreme ways. And so you have hyperbole there in Psalm 51:5. I don't really prefer the Christian Standard Bible's rendering, and I don't really prefer the NIV's rendering. But then again, I don't really like the sentiment in all the others either. Shapen in iniquity, that made in sin is what that means. That's what he's saying. And he's saying it because he felt like that. You have any questions or comments about that particular passage? Any observation you want to make about that one? Okay, what about missing passages? Anybody seen a meme like this on the Facebook? Anybody ever seen one? I've seen them floating around. First thing I would say about it is I can add a lot of passages to that meme. There are more passages than are just listed there, and it really revolves around, somebody took passages out of your Bible because they didn't like those passages and they want to convince you of something else, so be very wary of that Bible because it's trying to deceive you. I'm not at all convinced of that. There is good reason for it. Now, you don't have to prefer it or like it, but there's good reason for it. And the reason for it is the King James includes these verses in the flow of the text. All of these and others that are not in some of the Bibles, the King James includes them in the flow of text. But some of the older manuscripts don't contain them. Turn with me to Acts 8. We'll just make it real simple and go to Acts 8 real quick. Acts 8, please. Keep in mind the King James was translated before the manuscripts, the earlier manuscripts were found. So what the King James translators were working with were those Byzantine manuscripts. And those manuscripts contained verses that some of the older manuscripts, earlier manuscripts from around the 400 time frame, they don't contain. So if you look in Acts chapter 8 and go down to verse 36, in my New American Standard Version, in Acts 8 and verse 36, I have verse 37. Oh, I can't believe it. Is that second bell? Hang tight. There, you have a 37. Anybody have verse 37 in Acts 8? Everybody? Anybody have it in brackets? Got it in brackets? Okay. Here's the reason it's in brackets. Because in some of the earlier manuscripts, it's not there. In some of the later manuscripts, it is there. The New American Standard has it, the ESV has it, all of them have it, but they don't necessarily have it in the flow of the paragraph. The ESV that I have right here has it in a footnote down at the bottom. It has a footnote between 36 and 38, and then you can read the verse down there. And the logic is the translators are simply being honest with us and telling us the truth about it, and they're saying this was in some of the later manuscripts, but it's not in some of the earlier manuscripts. They're just telling us the way it is. They're not trying to delete information from the text. They're telling us what the manuscripts actually say. And that's what I want them to do. I want them to tell me what those manuscripts say. And so if you have a Bible that skips from 36 to 38, look around in there, there'll be a footnote, there'll be something that tells you what verse 37 says. And there may be more than that. Interestingly enough, the ASV from 1901 has some really good footnotes on some of these passages that aren't in the normal flow of text. If you have more questions about that, we'll talk about it. Now we'll wrap up like this. Some attitudes toward English translations. We're thankful we have so many. We are thankful we can compare and study and read and grow. We appreciate that most translation teams are trying to understand the manuscripts and do good work. We also understand that some may be biased. They may be coming from a different position. For example, those that translated the King James Version were primarily Roman Catholic. That was the time in which they did their work. So they did the very best they could with it. The third thing is we do not look at the King James or any other English translation as the standard by which all others should be judged. We look at the manuscripts, and we force ourselves to do that. Then we know that if we disqualify an entire English translation because of some mistranslated word or phrase, then we won't have any Bible to read. If we look at the King James and say, well, there's an issue there in Matthew chapter 4, so that one's out. What are we going to do when we see an issue in the New American Standard? What are we going to do when we see an issue in another one? Eventually, we'll find ourselves with nothing. The manuscripts are the thing. The translations, well, they're going to have some issues, and we have to work through that. And then by faith, we know that God preserves His word for us, sufficient for our use, and we can understand His will with any of these English translations if we're willing to do the work. We have to do our part. We have one more discussion planned for this. If you don't want to do that, let me know. If you want to continue, let me know, and we'll just kind of wrap it up next week if that suits you. Thanks very much. Sorry we didn't have a lot of time for questions, but we can do that next week if you'd like.